In this after party so far, we've been talking about the importance of making this big shift from the what to the how, and how this big shift involves prioritizing spiritual values. Two spiritual values in particular, humility and hope. And last session, we talked about how this creates a profile that you can sort of locate yourself on your discipleship path. And we talked about the combatant. So the combatant, to refresh, is somebody who is actually low in humility, but high in hope. Right? The combatant thinks they're right, the other side's wrong. This session, we're going to talk about the profile of the exhausted. And the exhausted is really the mirror image of the combatant. So the exhausted actually is high in humility, because the exhausted isn't sure they have all the answers, and they're willing to actually possibly entertain other answers. But the exhausted is low in hope. They're ready to give up if they haven't given up already. That's the exhausted. David, why is this profile, the profile of the exhausted, so important in politics right now?
Well, it's really important in politics for one very simple reason, which is that's the majority of Americans. So the majority of Americans right now are in what's called the exhausted majority. Almost 70% of Americans fit broadly within the category of an exhausted majority. These are people who, they long for compromise. They come from the right, they come from the left, they come from the middle, but they long for dialogue and they despair at the same time. They feel like their voices don't count, or they're drowned out by the loudest, angriest people. Maybe they venture a thought or an idea on social media and they're quickly gang tackled by their super angry uncle, or their extremely angry niece, you name it. They're tired at the very mention of politics. We need the voices of those people who actually long for compromise.
Russell, talk about a particular profile of the exhausted in the church. I'm thinking about pastors, because you speak to a lot of pastors. What's going on for them?
Well, pastoral work is exhausting anyway. You're having to be with people on their deathbed, on their wedding day, and in their spiritual crisis. So you're giving so much of yourself anyway to the whole of a person. And then you add to it this expectation that the pastor ought to be an avatar of my politics, which often for a lot of pastors, the expectation is not just that my pastor agrees with me on all my political ideas, but that my pastor articulates all of my political ideas as though they were revealed truth. And what you have are often pastors who, if they're not careful, they start to become depleted by this. Some of them leave.
Don't demand that your pastor or anyone else around you agree with you on everything. You need to recognize your own frailty and fallenness, and guess what? 5 years from now, some of the things you might feel the most strident about right now, you might look back on and say, oh, oops, that wasn't quite right.
We need pastors to step forward in some ways and not in others. Okay. Pastors shouldn't feel as though I need to be an expert on every possible issue. But what a pastor does need is to say, in addition to thinking through what are the spiritual needs of my congregation, what do they need to know, a lot of times pastors are also thinking through what kind of blowback am I going to be dealing with? And so sometimes that can create a risk aversion where the pastor doesn't really want to speak to anything that's going to make someone angry. And so having a pastor who's able to, from the message of the Word of God, remind us of the fact that life is more than just whatever we're debating right now. And also to have a sense of, I cannot be your mascot for whatever your particular issue is, and still effectively lead you spiritually. And frankly, that's what you need. That's right. And so a lot of the people who just want a pastor who's a cable talking head, they actually don't want that when they're sick. Yeah, that's right. Or when their marriage falls apart.
So if you're a lay member of the exhausted majority, or you are a pastor who is exhausted, we need you. The church needs you. God needs you. And let's together step forward.
with every place on this quadrant, I think we could make a mistake by thinking, I am one of these, and I have been, and I always will be in some sort of a horoscope way. That's not the case. It describes a place where one is, and maybe a tendency that one has, where you tend to go. For me, I think the exhausted phase was something that came at a particular time in life, after a great deal of frenetic activity. And I think, as with so many other things, when you can't see the immediate fruit of your efforts, there's a way of exhausting the soul and exhausting the heart. I think exhaustion comes about the same way it does in the physical world. You do something, you press at something, and all your energy is expended. Politics exhausts so many people right now because it demands too much. When politics is demanding one's entire identity and place of belonging, then there is a kind of vigilance that comes with watching that all of the time, that it just isn't sustainable. All of us are a lot more complicated than whatever our political views are. And once we start to see ourselves only in those terms, or preeminently in those terms, we lose something of our humanity. And ultimately, the energy that's directed toward that strips away the ability to respond as human beings. And that's what the church often seems like. And that's especially true after we've come through the past several years with the Trump era, the COVID era, any number of things. We're in news cycles that don't ever seem to end. I used to say, oh, I dread election years because election years make Christians go crazy. We're in a time right now where we're always in an election year because it's not just that there's 24 hours a day cable news, there's 24 hours a day social media prompts. You just can't sustain a consistent level of engagement through all of that. And that's especially true when we have the sorts of conflicts that become personal. So it's not just you and I disagree on this, it's you and I are of different countries, or within the church, different religions. So that leads to a sense of exhaustion as well. You just don't have the energy to continue to engage because you don't see that time of quiet in between. It just doesn't happen right now. Well, the partisan mind is tiring because the partisan mind, for one thing, can't deal with the complexity of human nature, my human nature or yours, because the partisan mind is surprised to see goodness and image of God on the other side, whatever that is. One of the reasons that we're in this situation is that we're not enlivened by biblical doctrine or biblical discipleship. We're instead really enlivened by whatever proves me to be right and you to be wrong. And in this secularized sort of environment, including secularized within the church, those are usually whatever's the primary point of controversy in the world around me. And what's usually the primary point of controversy are political or culture war issues. That's why I almost never see a church that is on the verge of splitting over the Trinity. I almost never see a church that's on the verge of splitting anymore over what's the right way to worship, even though we saw so much of that, say, 15, 20 years ago. Instead, what we see are churches that are on the verge of splitting over the very same things that are being screamed about all around us. One of the things that I recognize now often, I have pastors who give me almost the exact same story of preaching on something and just sort of parenthetically saying, turn the other cheek. For instance, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. To have people angry and coming up afterward and challenging the weakness and the refusal to fight on those things. And what was really disturbing to me is that inevitably when the pastor would say, well, I'm literally quoting Jesus Christ, the person would say, well, yeah, but that worked at one time, but it won't work now. Now we have to fight. As though there's some time period where there's an escape hatch from the Sermon on the Mount. And in many cases, what you had happening were people who would say, well, we're okay with the doctrinal teaching that we can find in Paul. It's Jesus we have a problem with. So we don't have a problem with the atonement. We have a problem with the person who is on the cross. That is a dangerous place to be. I realized at one point that social media particularly was exhausting me because I found myself losing the ability to maintain attention. I always needed to know what's going on. So if I was on a plane that didn't have Wi-Fi, I noticed that I would start to feel like, oh wait, I don't know what's going on. And I really found myself noticing this when I went to, there's a monastery in Kentucky that I go to often to sort of get away from everything. And I was there in the quiet praying, and I noticed that I kept checking Twitter. And I said, I can't do this. I'm here to get away from everything and pray. And I put my phone away, and I noticed that I was agitated. And when I really explored it, I realized what I really was feeling like is I'm vulnerable because I don't know what's going on. And it was at this sort of primal level, a sense of almost feeling like walking into a dark house and not knowing if there's something there ready to jump out at you. And that's a really unhealthy way to see things. Social media exhausts a person by giving these hits of dopamine. Every time you send something out there and somebody responds to it or hits its target, that ultimately strips down your abilities. Like anything else, you need more and more of it in order to get the same result. Social media also exhausts because people can get a skewed view of what people think of them by looking at social media. It's a sense in which I ultimately said, I need to stop looking at Twitter replies because it messes with my mind. It can give you this sense of siege mentality. Everybody hates me. And that can happen for anybody. For some people, it's because they don't get response the way that they want it on social media. They think nobody cares about me, which isn't true, but it can feel like it. Someone said, I realized everybody that I meet in person says I'm the greatest person ever, and everybody on Twitter says I'm horrible. And neither of those things are true. Neither of those things could be true, but it's the nature of how it works. That can lead you to a place where if you're sort of constantly on guard, looking around, you're going to become exhausted.